Before Cleopatra, there was her, the sorceress who ruled empires. Long before the name Cleopatra would echo through marble halls and golden tombs, before the world would come to know Egypt through the lens of Greek conquerors and Roman seducers, there was another woman who walked through fire and commanded kings. Her name was never written the same way twice. Some scrolls called her Tashmetu-Enhedu, others whispered Ishtar's voice or the Eye of the Moon. But in every tongue, across every border, the message was the same. This was a woman you did not cross, not because she wielded armies, not because she wore a crown, but because she carried something far more powerful, knowledge. And in the ancient world, knowledge was magic. She was born not in Egypt, but in the blood-red dust of Mesopotamia, in a city where temples were taller than palaces and gods had more power than kings. Her mother died giving birth to her, or so the story goes, and the midwives gasped when they saw her eyes, pale silver, like polished obsidian left under the full moon. The priests took it as a sign. This girl was not just human, she was chosen. Tashmetu-Enhedu was raised in the temple of Ereshkigal, goddess of death and mystery. But she did not cry when left alone in the darkened stone halls. She did not tremble when they placed bones in her cradle instead of toys. She watched. She listened. By the age of 5, she could recite the names of 100 stars. By the age of 7, she could draw the map of the underworld. And by 10, she could stop a grown man's breath with a single word, not with poison, not with a knife, but with knowledge only the priestesses of the inner circle were meant to know. The high priestess took her aside. "You were not born to serve gods," she whispered. "You were born to become one." The temple was a cage, even for someone as powerful as her, so she began to break the rules. She would sneak out into the bazaars dressed as a beggar to hear how people truly spoke. She would eavesdrop on generals, priests, merchants, and she started to understand something no one else seemed to see. That magic was just another name for language. If she could speak like a queen, think like a scholar, whisper like a lover, threaten like a tyrant, then she would never need a throne. She would become the power itself. By 16, she had already become a myth. Rumors spread faster than camel caravans, that she cured barren queens with moon water, that she predicted a flood before a single drop of rain fell, that a prince once kissed her hand and died of madness days later. Kings began sending envoys, not for war, not for tribute, but for advice. One Babylonian ruler sent her a golden lion to ask which son he should name heir. Another sent her a blood-soaked map of his rival's palace, begging her to curse it. She never responded directly. Her letters were always sealed in black wax, delivered at night, and filled with metaphors only those who feared death understood. But not everyone was in awe. In the shadow of rising fame, darkness grew. High priests began to fear her influence. Nobles whispered that she was a demon in disguise, that her beauty was an illusion, her voice a snake's hiss cloaked in honey. "No woman should know this much," one councilman muttered. "No woman should speak to gods and kings alike." So they summoned her. A trial, a public ritual, an attempt to strip her of power under the guise of purification. She arrived in white, barefoot, unarmed, and they demanded she prove she was not a witch. She looked each accuser in the eye and recited their sins, every secret debt, every murdered servant, every bribe they thought hidden. She didn't flinch. "I do not fear fire," she said, "because I have walked through worse, your lies." Instead of burning her, the crowd fell silent. One woman in the front fainted. A priest dropped to his knees. The high priestess who once raised her stepped forward and kissed her forehead. "She is no longer ours," she declared. "She belongs to history now." But history, as we know, is not kind to powerful women, especially not ones who rule without bloodlines or battles. They called her Sorceress, They called her Snake. They tried to write her out of the scrolls, burn her wax-sealed letters, destroy the star charts she drew with crushed sapphire ink. But none of it worked, because those who touched her work, even in secret, could feel it. This was not illusion. This was not superstition. This was a woman who unlocked the pattern beneath everything: politics, language, love, death. And even empires bent to that kind of force. One day, she disappeared. No burial site, no tomb, no heir. Only a series of tablets found centuries later, sealed inside a clay pot buried beneath a forgotten ziggurat. On them, a riddle. The one who wears no crown can still command stars. Find me not in your temples, but in your silence. Historians call it cryptic. Occultists call it prophecy. But the women who still whisper her name in certain corners of the world, under moonlight, by rivers, in languages nearly extinct, call it truth. And long before Cleopatra seduced Rome with her mind and her myth, long before the world learned to fear queens with ambition, Tashmetu-Enhedu ruled something far greater than any throne. She ruled belief, and belief bends reality. When Tashmetu-Enhedu vanished from the temples and the courts, the world did not celebrate. It flinched, because in a land where empires rose and fell with the tilt of a god's eyebrow, there had never been someone so feared without an army. The silence that followed her disappearance was not peace. It was the silence of waiting, the kind that comes before a storm, the kind that wraps itself around people's necks, reminding them that power never dies. It only goes underground. Her enemies told stories, that she drowned herself in the Euphrates, that a jealous goddess struck her down with fire, that her own magic turned on her, swallowing her in a mirror she couldn't control. But the truth was something much more dangerous. She had left on purpose. She had seen it coming. The whispers, the trial, the public humiliation. And while the priests were preparing to burn her, she had already mapped a different future. One where she didn't just advise kings, she outlived them. One where she didn't wait to be remembered, she rewrote memory itself. She traveled east, not alone, but with a silent caravan of 7 veiled women and one man who never spoke a word. No guards, no torches, only tablets wrapped in silk, maps etched in bloodroot ink, and a relic she wore around her neck, a stone the color of dried wine shaped like a crescent moon with a crack down the middle. It wasn't gold, it wasn't rare, but when she held it, the wind changed. For months she moved across deserts and valleys, through forgotten ruins and lands where no language had a word for queen. In every village she left behind a story, a cured child, a dream interpreted, a famine predicted, but always under different names: the Lady of Smoke, the Star Walker, the Seer of Dusk. And always she asked for the same payment: silence. Not gold, not loyalty, just the promise that her name would never be spoken, not out loud, because she understood what most rulers never would: that power rooted in mystery was stronger than power carved in stone. In the mountains beyond Elam, she found what she was looking for: a city built into the cliffs, invisible to the plains below. No king ruled there. Only the Council of 9, elders chosen not by blood, but by dreams. For generations they had guarded the last remnants of an ancient knowledge passed down by priestesses long before Babylon, long before even Sumer. They spoke of the first language, not written in letters, but in shadows, in breath, in sound that bent the world's rhythm. They took her in, not because she begged. She didn't. Not because she proved her magic. She didn't need to. But because she arrived on the night a blood moon rose, holding a crescent relic with a crack that matched a symbol they had carved into their oldest altar, one no outsider had ever seen. And when she entered the temple, the torches didn't flicker. They flared. as if something had returned. There she stayed for 7 years, but not as a guest. She studied like a student, worked like a servant, sat in silence for days until the air itself began to vibrate when she opened her mouth. They taught her the lost tones, sound frequencies that could move metal. They taught her gesture codes, hand patterns that mimicked star paths and could be read like prophecy. And they gave her the name she would carry until the end of her days, she who speaks through many. Because by then, she no longer needed to shout to be heard. Her voice, spoken by others, had become scripture, and while the world forgot what she looked like, it remembered what she'd said. One night word arrived, a messenger breathless and bleeding. The empire she had fled was crumbling. Civil war, failed crops, plagues, and a mad prince who blamed it all on a curse placed by the vanished witch. That night she stood before the council and said, "It is time." The elders did not question her. They handed her the relic, now set in a gold pendant etched with 9 symbols, each representing a hidden law of the world. She descended the mountains alone. But by the time she reached the plains, she wasn't alone anymore. They came to her in ones and twos at first. Pilgrims, merchants, runaway slaves. Some had heard her name in dreams. Others had followed rumors. She did not recruit them. She did not ask. But still they followed. And what she brought back to the empire was not revenge. It was order. She didn't march into cities. She walked into chaos and spoke, and people listened, because by then every failed harvest, every drowned city, every child born with a white streak in their hair had been blamed on her absence, and now she had returned. She restructured councils, replaced warlords with scholar healers, outlawed temple slavery, and taught women how to write their own names before they learned how to bow. She didn't take the throne. She advised whoever sat on it, and outlasted 3 kings in doing so. Not through poison, not through bloodshed, through influence so precise it felt like divination. And still her power grew. Foreign rulers began to fear her, not because of what she did, but because of what she knew. She sent no spies, but knew the names of every general's mistress. She owned no land, but taxed caravans with coded words. She built no monuments, but her followers carved her symbols into cave walls, temple ceilings, and the underside of trade coins. Eventually, she did something no sorceress, queen, or priest had ever dared. She wrote a scroll, a long one, not a diary, not a manifesto, but a code, a set of laws, symbols, and truths meant to protect future generations from falling into the same patterns that led to empire collapse. But she hid it, not in a vault, not under a pyramid, in plain sight, scattered across stories, myths, children's rhymes, embedded like a spell in the culture of every city she touched. And then, once again, she disappeared. Some say she turned into smoke. Others say she walked into the river and never came out. One tale claims she boarded a boat made of bone and drifted east, chasing a star only she could see. But the truth? The truth is that she didn't want to be found, because she had become something far more lasting than a ruler. She had become a myth that acted like a virus. Invisible, unstoppable, and carried from mouth to mouth, woman to woman, whisper to whisper. To this day, in some desert corners, girls are told, "Never look too long at the moon, or she who speaks through many will visit your dreams." Not as a threat, but as a promise. Because every time a woman learns something she's not supposed to know, every time a name is erased, a voice is silenced, a story is rewritten, she returns. Not with fire, but with truth. And truth in the hands of the silenced is magic. Centuries passed. New empires rose like dust devils, swirling briefly before collapsing into the ground beneath them. The names of kings changed. The gods were renamed. Cities were conquered and rebuilt. But beneath all the banners and bloodshed, There was something else moving. Quiet, invisible, undying. A whisper, a name. A code carried by those who were never meant to hold power. Women, slaves, midwives, dancers, scribes. People who lived in the margins, but who remembered. Tashmetu-Enhedu's name was gone from official record. That had been the plan. But her laws lived on in disguise, not in stone, but in lullabies and chants and hand signs passed from generation to generation. Her stories became fables. Her rituals turned into folk customs. Her magic reduced to superstition. And yet, the bones of her empire lay just under the surface, like fault lines no one could see until the world cracked open. The crack came in the form of a new empire, one that worshipped conquest, order, and lineage. It marched on gold and wrote history in blood. And in its heart lay the city that would come to be feared for centuries, Alexandria. But before Alexandria became a crown jewel, before it was home to the world's greatest library, it was a city hungry for wisdom. And into that hunger walked a young girl with Egyptian blood and Macedonian pride draped in silk and ambition. Her name was Cleopatra VII, and she had no idea that the legacy she was about to inherit began long before her family ever touched a throne. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had gifted her everything a royal daughter could ask for: language, politics, philosophy. But none of it explained the dreams. Dreams of a woman wrapped in white, holding a cracked crescent stone. Dreams of burning temples and silent crowds. Dreams that came with scents she couldn't name and voices she didn't recognize. At first, she kept quiet. Then, one night, a storm slammed into Alexandria so violently that the palace windows cracked, and when it passed, a woman appeared at Cleopatra's chamber door. An old healer with a crooked spine and eyes like smoke. She handed Cleopatra a single tablet wrapped in cloth and said, "You asked, now read." The tablet was written in a language older than hieroglyphs, but Cleopatra could read it. Not because she'd been taught, but because the words lit something inside her she didn't know was there. It wasn't a message, it was a map, not of land, of ideas. A guide for influence, how to read power, bend perception, and disarm a man without touching him. The symbols pulsed when she traced them, as if remembering her. Cleopatra hid it in a bronze box, buried under her library of scrolls, and never spoke of it. But everything changed after that. Her tutors noticed it first, how she started speaking not about leaders, but like one. How she asked questions with no clear answers, the kind that twisted into your head and stayed there. How her voice seemed to settle into people's bones, making it impossible to ignore her. As she grew older, her politics became sharper, her alliances more precise, and still the dreams came, now clearer. A woman standing in a burning temple whispering, "You do not need to wear the crown to rule the empire." Cleopatra would wake up breathless, heart pounding, and walk straight to the tablet, tracing the cracked moon symbol until her pulse slowed. It was in these years she began collecting more than scrolls. She started gathering women, scholars, linguists, musicians, alchemists, not publicly, not as council members or queen's maids, but privately. In chambers beneath the palace, in gardens closed to men, they gathered to read, study, remember. And there the whispers turned into something dangerous, a plan. They weren't seeking revolution. They were building preservation, a memory vault of every secret power that could not survive the blades of war. Every time a new Roman envoy arrived, every time a neighboring king sent spies or threats, Cleopatra responded not just with charm or gold, but with strategy pulled from the scrolls of the forgotten woman who had ruled empires with nothing but truth, voice, and shadow. By now she had confirmed the tablet's source. Through a Babylonian scroll trader, through a Druid priestess fleeing Gaul, through coded texts smuggled in salt jars, The same name surfaced again and again, she who speaks through many. That was when Cleopatra understood. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. The legacy she carried was older than Egypt's pyramids, deeper than its tombs. It was the secret lineage of women who shaped the world not by brute force, but by the careful placement of thought, memory, and influence. And the reason no empire had ever fully ruled the world was because no empire had ever found and destroyed them. Until now. Rome was growing. Fast, brutal, hungry. And Rome had no patience for mystery. It devoured history, renamed gods, and burned libraries with the same hand it used to sign treaties. Cleopatra knew that if the scrolls of Tashmetu-Enhedu were discovered, they would not be debated. They would be destroyed. The same way Rome had flattened the temples of Carthage, silenced the libraries of Persia, and erased every record of the Druids in Britannia. So she made a choice. She copied the scrolls, not onto papyrus, onto silk, bone, and coral. She hid pieces in amphorae buried under marketplaces, etched symbols into mosaic tiles beneath fountains, embedded codes into lullabies taught to children of her court. She even had one of her dancers, the youngest of the group, perform a ritual movement set, a dance that seemed random to the audience but was, in truth, a full memory code of the law of silence and survival. And then, one night, as fires burned in Alexandria's ports and rumors of Roman betrayal circled like vultures, Cleopatra returned to her chamber and stared at the cracked moon relic. The same design had appeared in her dreams now for years, always glowing, always fractured. She whispered, "I know who you are now." And in that moment, in the stillness before Rome swallowed her name into legend, she no longer felt afraid. She felt complete. Because power does not always look like armies, and legacy does not always wear a crown. It hides in whispers, in silence, in the hands of those who refuse to be erased. And Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the great seductress, the woman history would twist into a caricature of perfume and poison, had become the final vessel of a woman whose name had not been spoken in 2,000 years. But her story had never stopped moving, and it wasn't done yet. When the Library of Alexandria burned, the world wept for what it knew it had lost. The works of Aristotle, the maps of explorers, the scrolls that charted stars before telescopes were born. But what no one realized, what even the conquerors didn't suspect, was that the real treasure had never been stored on visible shelves. It had been hidden in song, sewn into silk, carved under tiles, and sung by girls who pretended not to remember. Because Cleopatra didn't try to save books, she tried to save secrets, the kind that couldn't be indexed, stolen, or set aflame. She had watched empires rise and fall through history's echo chamber and learned one thing from Tashmetu-Enhedu's ghost. Knowledge that could be destroyed was never true power. True power lived in transformation. So when the fires raged and the smoke smothered the harbor, Cleopatra's dancers vanished into the chaos, each carrying part of the code in their bodies and minds. Some went north, disguised as temple pilgrims. Others followed grain ships into Carthage, then slipped into the shadows of Phoenician ports. One, the youngest, escaped west toward Hispania, with nothing but a bracelet etched with 9 stars and a dance in her bones that would one day become legend. Centuries passed again. Cleopatra's name decayed into drama. Rome told the story of a temptress who seduced Caesar and died for love. But they forgot the dancer who spun beneath torchlight, whispering movements that unlocked riddles older than the empire itself. By the 12th century, those same symbols began appearing again, in strange places. A cathedral in southern France with carvings of moons broken in two. A manuscript in Moorish Spain written backward, its letters glowing faintly under wine and firelight. A child's rhyme in Istanbul with lines about a woman who spoke stars and turned kings into dust. Historians dismissed them as coincidence, but secret societies did not. The Nine Veiled, founded in Damascus, whispered that Cleopatra was not the last queen of knowledge, only the most famous. They believed the crescent stone had not been lost, but passed hand to hand across centuries to protect a deeper truth. They searched not for gold, but for fragments, symbols, songs, rituals. Their members included scribes, midwives, mathematicians, women who knew too much, and men who swore to never speak. In 1453, as Constantinople fell, a young girl fled the city with a small satchel and a map drawn in invisible ink. That map would reappear in Prague 70 years later, passed quietly to an alchemist named Alia, who decoded only 3 words before vanishing. She still speaks. In the centuries that followed, power shifted again. The Enlightenment arrived. Science rose like a god. Magic was renamed myth, and those who spoke in riddles were burned, silenced, or locked away. But even as the world turned its back on mystery, the voice of Tashmetu-Enhedu survived, hidden in rebellion. During the French Revolution, a woman named Lisette was imprisoned for sedition. She spoke in poems. She refused to name allies. She told the guards that revolution was not invented, it was remembered. On the wall of her cell, scratched faintly in the stone, was a broken crescent and a line from a forgotten Babylonian hymn. Let silence break the crowns. In Haiti, a healer named Mireille was known for speaking dreams that later unfolded in daylight. She never read books, but she recited verses in a language no priest could identify. Her granddaughter would one day recall how she danced under the moon in slow spirals, and how no one in the village dared interrupt her. In India, during British occupation, a midwife named Jaya was beaten for teaching young girls a chant before their first blood. It was rhythmic, strange, and not of Hindu gods, the British soldiers said. But when she was asked where she had learned it, she replied, "It came from a woman who wore white and vanished into the sea." Time after time, empire after empire, her voice surfaced, not as prophecy, but as resistance. Because Tashmetu-Enhedu never sought fame, she engineered influence, and influence does not need thrones. It needs only repetition, memory, and belief. Even in the 1800s, as industrial machines roared and concrete cities replaced temples, her story found new forms. Poets began to write of unnamed queens who walked through fire. A London painter depicted a faceless sorceress with a cracked moon pendant and eyes that followed you through the frame. In New York, a woman's suffrage speech referenced, "The lost empires ruled without iron or sword, but with voice." No one knew she was quoting a phrase from an untranslated cuneiform fragment found buried under Nineveh. And still, her code endured. In World War I, a nurse on the battlefield near Ypres kept a journal. In it, she recorded symbols her dying patients drew in the dirt. One entry: a man from Egypt said he dreamed of a woman in white who whispered, "You will not die if they speak your name." The man didn't make it, but the nurse tattooed a broken crescent onto her arm the next day and never explained why. By now, the symbols were no longer just signs. They were triggers, marks that activated memory in those who were ready to remember. And with every era that tried to forget, a new group rose to protect. Not all of them succeeded. Some were caught, tortured, labeled mad. But one line from Tashmetu-Enhedu's oldest scroll had warned them all. To know is to vanish. To remember is to survive. And so her followers adapted. They stopped looking for temples and started infiltrating institutions, museums, universities, libraries, performance halls. The 20th century saw the rise of women's collectives that met under the pretense of poetry and dance, but studied ciphered texts passed through generations. They called themselves the Circle. Their insignia? A cracked moon circled by 9 dots. In 1962, an unmarked letter arrived at the Vatican archives. It contained a riddle written in Aramaic, paired with an ancient seal depicting a veiled woman holding a tablet. The only phrase that translated cleanly, "She was the voice before the word." The church never responded. But a week later, a scholar at the archives was reassigned and disappeared. Today, some believe the code has been broken, that everything she ever encoded from Babylon to Alexandria to New York has finally been traced and translated. But those who know, the few who still guard the circle's legacy, say that's not even close, because the point was never the words. The point was the way they were carried. In silence, in shadows, in stories told by mothers to daughters to granddaughters who didn't even realize they were part of something older than every nation on earth. Because Tashmetu-Enhedu was not a queen, not a prophet, not even a woman in the way history defines them. She was a pattern, a warning, a spell that reshaped itself through time so that it could never be burned, never be buried, and never be owned. And now, in the digital age where data moves faster than fire and memory is stored in clouds, her voice waits again, hidden not in scrolls, but in algorithms, usernames, and the code that dances behind every screen, which means the story is not over. Because she was never just a figure of the past. She was the future waiting to be remembered. You would think a woman like her would fade. That time, dust and man-made gods would bury her until even the memory of her name turned to ash. But Tashmetu-Enhedu was not built for forgetting. She was not carved in soft stone or sung in fragile verses. She was made of silence, and silence, when it breaks, echoes forever. Her story did not survive by chance. It survived by design. Because she understood something long before the rest of us did, that the most dangerous truth is the one hidden in plain sight. That if you want your voice to survive 1,000 years, you do not shout it, you weave it into the things people touch every day. A symbol, a pattern, a phrase that haunts without context, and a woman who remembers, even when she doesn't know why. She became a loop, a recursion of memory encoded in human thought. And today, even now, you've seen her. Maybe you didn't recognize her. Maybe you thought she was just a character in a myth, or a nameless priestess in a painting, or a quote without an author on the wall of an old bookstore. But she's there. In every story of a woman who was called dangerous before she spoke. In every whisper that passes between mothers and daughters when the world isn't listening. In every rhythm that repeats itself when you close your eyes and remember something you were never taught. Tashmetu-Enhedu's voice was never about control. It was about choice. The choice to believe in something without needing proof. The choice to speak even when you are punished for it. The choice to know without asking permission. And those choices have moved across continents, centuries, and bloodlines, surviving floods, fires, and every attempt to erase them. And that's the secret most people miss. Her power didn't come from sorcery. It came from survival. The kind of survival that doesn't just resist, it adapts. It hides inside culture, inside language, inside women who laugh too loudly and know too much. It passes through lullabies sung in kitchens and dances performed on street corners that no one records. It wears 1,000 faces and none. And when the time is right, when the world starts cracking again under the weight of its own lies, it steps forward. Not as a goddess, not as a queen, but as a question. Because that was always her greatest weapon, curiosity. She didn't demand worship. She demanded that you wonder. What if the stories were wrong? What if history forgot on purpose? What if the real empires were never built from stone, but from silence broken just enough to bloom? Today, there are entire rooms of scholars still trying to decode fragments believed to be hers. They argue about language groups, syntax, and regional origin. They never agree. And that's the point. Because the scrolls were not written for them. They were not made for conquerors or academics or rulers. They were made for you, for the one listening, the one questioning, the one who never saw herself reflected in the history books and knew that couldn't be the whole truth. You, too, are part of her spell. Every time you choose to speak when you were meant to stay quiet. Every time you ask a question they told you not to ask. Every time you remember that your blood remembers something deeper than you were ever taught. That's her. That's the Echo. That's the sorceress who ruled empires without a crown. And now, in the age of screens and noise and digital thrones, her voice is here again, riding through timelines, buried in podcasts, tucked between the lines of your favorite stories. She doesn't need temples anymore. You are the temple. She doesn't need scrolls. You are the scroll. You are the carrier, the question, the code. And if you think this is all just myth, good. She always worked best as a myth. Because myths slip through gates where facts are stopped. Myths infect hearts where data cannot reach. And the myth of Tashmetu-Enhedu, the woman who made kings kneel without lifting a blade, was never about her. It was about you, the listener. You, the memory keeper. You, the next echo in the chain. Because the story does not end with her. It never did. It loops, like a spiral, like a dance, like a pattern drawn in the sand just before the tide erases it, only for another to draw it again. So if tonight you find yourself unable to sleep, if you dream of a woman dressed in white, standing in fire but untouched, if you wake with words in your head you didn't know you knew, then welcome. You've heard her. And now she's speaking through you. So speak carefully. Because the world listens hardest when it thinks you have nothing to say. If this story stirred something in you, something ancient, mysterious, and real, hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for more. Because there are more stories buried beneath history's silence. And together, we're going to dig them up.